this year, the world became familiar with stay-at-home orders, with countries adopting strong measures to keep their citizens safe in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. However, for countless Nigerian women, home has not been a safe place. Victims of varied degrees of abuse suddenly found themselves chatting with their abusers. Forced coexistence, job loss, escalating stress, anxiety, and apprehension has led to increased household tension, which turned many partners into abusers and worsened existing abuse. Though the situation now referred to as the shadow pandemic was a worldwide occurrence and not restricted to Nigeria, what is the Nigerian government, its relevant agencies, and social advocacy organizations doing to check the unprecedented cases of rising violence against women? Today, we shall be discussing responding to the shadow pandemic and gender violence. Hello and welcome to Break It Down, where we make matters of policies, societal issues, governance and development easily understood by all. With me today I have Ambassador Nkoyo Toyo. Ambassador Nkoyo Toyo is a lawyer of high repute and Nigeria's former ambassador to Ethiopia. She's also former member of the Nigerian House of Representatives and one of the conveners of Women for Women initiative. She is also the founder, Gender and Development Action, GADA. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Moji, for having me here today.
So nice to have you again.
Thank you.
On set, because I know we're going to be getting a lot of education on gender. So we're talking about responding to the shadow pandemic and gender violence. On this show, we try to break it down. We try to start from the beginning, from the basics. What exactly is the shadow pandemic and why was violence more prevalent during the COVID-19 lockdown?
Thank you very much. I think we must start by why was violence more prevalent before we talk about the shadow nature of that pandemic. I think we need to start by asking ourselves what's going on with the pandemic itself. Why are we calling it a pandemic? What's the story behind the story? You know, many people saw the pandemic first of all as a health issue. People were dying. People didn't know what the cause of the death was. People didn't know how to manage the crisis that came with the death, the sudden death. And this was something you couldn't see, something you couldn't define, something you didn't know where it was coming from and where it was going to. So there was a sense of panic already. It's that sense of panic that created a sense of urgency, that created a counter-reaction. And some of the counter-reactions we saw were people saying, let's shut down our countries, let's shut down economies, let's shut down homes. And basically what it meant is that as we shut down the economy, many families went back into their different corners and their responses to the daily needs of the family changed completely. But as we know today, the pandemic has had not just a created a health crisis for many countries because of the capacity of the health systems that exist in countries to deal with it. It has also created a huge and enormous problem of economic scale that we have not seen in the recent past. So the shadow bit about it is, what are those things that came with the pandemic? And if we take it to the level of the domestic, oftentimes the domestic is the domain of women. That's why we talk about unpaid work. A lot of the work that women put into the household, work which is not paid for. When you care for children, you clean the house, you cook the food of the family, it's assumed that that is your responsibility. So what happened was that many families now retired into the closet. Husbands now came back home. Work was no longer an option for them to go out and engage themselves alternatively. So the family became a more nuclear environment. And in that nuclear environment came the exaggeration of existing tensions and conflicts that had always existed. They had always existed, but there was a way of dealing with it. Because if you're a man who couldn't provide for your family, as long as you left the house in the morning and gave the impression you were going for work, it meant you were doing something. And that sort of gave you a sense of hope that you will be able to come home and do something for your family. At the same time, if you're a woman who stayed at home, you'll probably be selling akara or something, a small thing, and then you had a small economy. But what happened was even that small economy was crashing. People couldn't access the goods. You could see women who were selling water leaves and things like that. They usually go out of the city to the farm areas and bring them in. Those economies were now shut down. And with that came pressures inside the family. So if you were already quarreling or having a disagreement with your husband, without food, without all the other things that used to augment for that pressure being in place, I think it exaggerated the pressure. Then the other thing that of course happened is Nigeria has become extremely violent. If you look at what we're seeing with insecurity and all of that, there are many young people, particularly in many parts of the country, who are in one form of cultism or the other. When the young girls were no longer going to school, they were now homebound. Of course, engaging exchanges between young people started. A lot of them ended up in very violent relationships. We saw cases of reported violence of magnitudes we have not seen in the past. And I don't know whether we should attribute this to the awareness that came with COVID and the issues that were discussed in the season of COVID, that we saw a very high level of reportage of cases of domestic violence.
You've talked about physical abuse now. What about sexual abuse? Now we heard about there was also an increase in sexually related cases.
I was actually going to go to the nature of their violence against women. They came in many forms. Yeah. They were also physical. There were some of them that were non-physical. A lot of even quarreling over something that you needn't have quarreled about. We're talking about issues of how people get into a relationship and it's depressing and it turns around to become a problem for even the couple themselves. The young people I was talking about were the ones that were particularly exposed to sexual abuse and sexual violence. Many of the cases we began to see with more people sitting at home and doing nothing and their lifestyles changing on account of the COVID was a lot of young girls being raped. A lot. Yesterday, for example, in Calabar, I got a call from my mother about a case of rape of a 12, 11 year. We saw so many of those cases. These were children who were not going to school, who were now left at home in their domestic environment. And again, you need to remember that home is a different definition for many people. Home is a very different thing for many of us. In many situations in Nigeria today, particularly among the urban poor, they live in one room. Yeah. They used to wake up, all of them will pour out in the morning and go their different ways. But with COVID, all of them were limited to that small space. So even that space necessitated moving around. And in moving around came all these other exposures and all those other exploitations. And so we saw a very high incidence of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. So these are issues that are interrelated. If your economy is broken, as it has become under COVID, you're likely to have more young people soliciting or more young girls soliciting for favors. And as you solicit for favors, come with unsolicited expectations from whoever you are getting the favors from. So I hope you're beginning to see the context
but
I'm talking about.
We have the extreme cases of fathers raping daughters of below 5 years old. Could this be the result of financial stress or depression or just some kind of mental insanity, mental ailment?
Well, I can tell you it's a combination of all those things. A depressed person has a mental health problem. There is no doubt in my mind that any depression of any form comes with a mental health situation. And the way people react to their mental health differs from one person to the other. You must also remember that in Nigeria increasingly, and it's very funny, I have heard so many funny things, that when things become very difficult like it became, people begin to blame all sorts of other things. And there are even some who believe that when they have that sexual relationship, it will bring favor, it will bring some sort of things to them. After all, they are having a relationship with a very innocent person. And we began to see, it will interest you, Muji, to hear, we began to see more of homosexuality, gay situations of gay rapes within the gay situation, because some people believe that having sex with a male will bring power. Not that this is not happening already, but there were contexts in which people were telling us that these things were done in order to get money and get resources from it. So we saw an environment that had become very, 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 very difficult for many people. And with the difficulty came this whole sense of, let me share the blame somehow. It's okay to do certain things. After all, I'm in a bad shape already. Things you would have restrained yourself from doing. It's not that you were not already prone to being a pedophile. If you were a pedophile, you were a pedophile, whatever you say. But you could restrain yourself here and there, and then the constraining of your movement and everything redefined for you the spaces that you had. And within the context of those spaces, we saw some of the things that we're talking about.
Very depressing. Just listening to you, I'm almost depressed already. Yeah, as a policymaker, you were in the NAS, the Nigerian National Assembly. Yeah. What can be done to prevent and address violence against women?
Let me start by saying that, if anything, Nigeria's done well with the laws. We've got the Child Rights Act, which takes care of the more children-focused types of health issues. We've got VAP, Violence Against Persons Protection Act, which is our most, to be honest, a very progressive law. Takes care of the victims, takes care of issues of reportage, issues of tracking, issues of opening up registers of offenders and all of that.
You were part of the NAS.
Yes. But the problem with all of that, is that Nigeria doesn't enforce anything. And increasingly, in my experience, I think the largest problem we have is the problem of something we call know-how. Know-how. It's one thing to have a document that says this is what you should do. It's another thing to have the funds to be able to do what that document says you should do. But more importantly is the fact that you need to know how to do it. Such things like what we are beginning to discuss requires a lot. When you get hold of somebody, apart from punishing the victim, you have to counsel, you have to treat, you have to follow up, you have to find out that the person that you have punished does not come back to the offender, to be an offender, second-time offender. There are many levels on this enforceability of the law that we have passed. The law is a kind of policy. That's what guides. That's the framework. That's the framing of the problem. But the issue here is that if you don't have the know-how, and I think that's where Nigeria is missing it a lot. We come up with beautiful policies, but the human beings to turn that policy into action.
Let's look at domestication. What do they mean by domestication of laws to start with? Because when I read it up, only 12 states till date, 12 southern states and 3 northern states, Kaduna, FCT and Plateau, have domesticated this law. Domestication means it becomes part of your local law. Okay. So you are under obligation to use the law. It also means that your law, your what do you call it? Your Ministry of Justice, your systems are in place to deal with it, because you have taken the law that was a national law and applicable at the national level, and you are saying this law shall also apply within the boundaries of my state. Okay. So that's the domestication. But like I told you again, that is where the problem is. We get women's organizations like ours shout, scream, and we get it domesticated. We've done it with the Child Rights Act. Child Rights Act was 2003. We've done it with the Child Rights Act. Until today, how many of those same southern states don't you have people coming there to have child marriages and all manner of things going on? Some parents, like in Cross River State, we have something called money wife, money bride, where you are owing, a family is owing, and they use the girl to offset the money that has been owed. So these things are going on in spite of the law. The question, and therefore, we need to ask ourselves, there is policy, there is law, there is advocacy, there is understanding. Why are we not seeing enough of action on the ground? We'll take a break now. When we come back, I am sure you'll be able to advise government on what to do. You're still on Break It Down, and we're still with Ambassador Nkoyo Toyo. We'll be back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Break It Down. We're still discussing the shadow pandemic and gender violence, and I'm still with Ambassador Nkoyotoyo of GADA. So we're talking about domesticating the VAP law. As you told us, not all governments have had the wherewithal. What exactly do you wish to advise government who are yet, or the governors who are yet to domesticate this law?
Well, I think that's a big question again. The advocacy is going on. A lot of civil society organizations are still working on it. I think what the law does is that it brings recognition to the problem. It enables you to frame the problem in a particular way. For example, what the VAP law does, it allows you to see what the way it happens affects the victims. You see what it happened, the aggressors, and all sorts of things, and what the state itself is able to do. So it does give you, kind of shares out the responsibility of what do we need to do with different aspects of the violence itself. So the law is important, and I'm going to say that to every country, every state that has not yet domesticated this VAP bill, or VAP Act, sorry, it's a time to look at it. In the face of violence of all kinds that we're beginning to see, insane violence that we're seeing all over the country, it is important that we bring in this act into our body of laws. If you look at the country today, the biggest problem of the country is insecurity, and these things are all interwoven. The insecurity, the damage, the harm to people, all these are forms of lack of protection and lack of security for life and property.
Let's talk about protection of victim and punishment of offender. This is where we've had a lot of issues in the past. People run to the police, and the police is not forthcoming. I
think we have, sadly, I must say, we've turned the police stations into, for lack of a better word, I hope I'm not going to be saying something that's very offensive. We've turned the police stations into a sort of revenue center.
Look, and this is why these cases mainly go unreported.
I am telling you what is going on. And even if it gets reported, how many can follow it through? There is no support system. Even when we say we're using pro bono lawyers to support the cases, take them to court, we have done a lot of pro bono cases in GADA, and I can tell you that we're having a huge bill running into many thousands of naira because the cases get delayed. They get the dates for the cases change, and all sorts of things happen. So it's a very difficult system that is not working. What I'm trying to tell you is that there is a law, there are frameworks, there are things that support us, but at the same time there are systems and institutions that are not working.
Now you have mentioned GADA. What exactly does GADA do?
Well, GADA has done some work.
What are the challenges?
Some work. What we've started to do now is we're trying to bring the traditional institutions in, because we're beginning to see that the formal institutions are not working. So we're trying to bring the traditional institutions in. So we have a relationship now with the traditional leaders from many communities where if anything happens, the first place to go and report these kinds of cases is at the traditional leaders, right? Because it's less expensive, it's more informal, it allows for follow-up. The woman can always go back and say, you know, that man you told not to beat me up is still beating me up. And that's much more accessible to women and much more powerful.
And there's a lot of respect still for the traditional institutions.
There is, and he is seen as an impartial arbiter in this case. So that's what GADA has done. It has worked, but it has only worked to the level of being a persuasive mechanism. It doesn't enforce anything.
Many believe that most women stay in abusive relationships because they have no other option. They have nowhere to run to. Unlike what obtains in some other parts of the world, there are shelters for the homeless, shelters for abused women, abused girls, and all of that. What do you think government can do in this regard, or private individuals, private organizations?
I think there's a lot of scope for something to be done in the issue of shelters. We need shelters. First of all, what the shelter does is that it breaks that abusive environment, that toxic environment in the home. It allows for some space. That allows for time. It allows for people to rethink what has happened and re-engage with each other. So it's an important mechanism. However, what tends to worry with the shelter, the situation of shelter, is sometimes the resolution of these crises, these problems, lasts for far longer than you can imagine. People leave those homes for 1 year. Some live for 6 months, some live for 3 months, and many times the shelter cannot cope with those long drawn cases. The shelter is good for 1 week, you leave and you return. Or 1 week, you leave and you find an alternative to living with the abusive husband. But what we have found out with shelters is that oftentimes the requirement of taking care of the people who are in an abusive relationship is very onerous, and they do not have the capacity nor the resources to manage those problems. But that doesn't make the shelter any less important. I know that in most states you have just 1 or 2 shelters, which is grossly inadequate, and usually just in the capital city. Does it mean that people are not being abused all over the country? So we need to do much more in terms of shelters. I think the churches can come in and build more shelters, like you say, private, not private, but social organizations like the church and the community groups can come in and set up shelters. And I think that in itself will become a strong mechanism.
Or corporate organizations who have
they can support
social
existing ones. Yeah, they can support existing ones.
They did a lot for the COVID
fund. They gave money directly, and none of that money sadly went into those kinds of things that you are talking about. That was also because in the planning, the ministry did not pay attention to using the women in that plan. If you remember, the ministries and the people who ran it, the Ministry of Women Affairs was not part. So we had to complain to government that the Women Affairs Ministry had been left out, and that the shadow pandemic itself was actually bigger than the real pandemic. Yeah.
You have worked so much with women, you have worked in shaping policies, you have worked as a lawyer from experience. What tips would you give to a woman who is in an abusive situation?
We need to create space. That's the most important thing, because violence comes at the heat of the moment. Something brings anger, brings disappointment, brings pressure. We must teach women how to learn to diffuse tension, manage. It's not about begging them. It's not about begging. It's about precipitating something that will happen. If you see, for example, and some of the cases we do is the case of Sex for Max, which is something we did a large campaign on. One of the things we told the young women is the red signals for a lecturer exploiting you is all over the place. He tells you to come to his office at an odd hour, and you go there at an odd hour. That's not being wise. So the use of wisdom and the use of the sensitivities around when violence is building up is something that is important. We must leave first in order to be able to make our case. A lot of women have died in the heat of arguments and of fights and things like that between husbands and their partners. So it's important that we remember that one of the quickest ways to deal with this is a more reflective approach of asking the question, what am I getting myself into, and how can I stop? We haven't learned to teach women those tricks. A bit of the problem with feminism, the way we perceive feminism, is that we have not also thought of feminism in the context of compassion and empathy. We need to think about this.
When you talk like this, people out there are some people, gender activists, feminists out there will tell you that you're blaming the victim.
Yes.
Rather than taking the word to the offender.
Yes.
Why tell the victim to be quiet? Why tell someone to have the balcony effect, for example? Why not?
The balcony.
Some tell you that they just sit down and somebody beats them up. The violent person is a violent person.
The balcony experience is power.
Yeah.
Anybody who understands the balcony experience is power.
Common sense.
My dear, if I want to deal with you, I take a step back and ask myself, how am I going to deal with you? I take back control of myself. I don't allow you to determine in a violent situation how the outcome exists. I want to determine what that outcome is. That's why I take the balcony experience. I am not exercising weakness. I am exercising strength. I am exercising authority, because I can now turn around and say, this is a matter for the police. It's not a matter for this man to beat me. Make an informed decision as to what I think is a better course of action.
And that is actually common sense. And sometimes tradition makes a lot of sense. I think we should tell our children and our women.
We must go back to to some of those things and redefine them in the context of what is truthful. Yes.
Thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been such an exciting time.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching us this week. We had Ambassador Nkoyo Toyo of the Gender and Development Action Gather. We'll be back same time next week. This is Break It Down.